Hello and welcome to Good Morning UK Have Your Say, a Force for Good's mid-morning show coming to you live from our nerve centre here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. And this is the show where we are British, we love the United Kingdom and we want to stay together. We are pro-UK, pro-United Kingdom, pro-Britain, and we are a voice for all of those who share that sentiment. Folks, thank you very much for watching, and please do share this show if you're coming in. Yeah, good. Adam went up to see, came up from Berwick. So good for you. I'm glad people are still smuggling themselves into Scotland these days, because it's certainly not, under the present leadership, giving a very welcoming impression to people. And indeed, it's turning people away, not just in that sense, in the metaphysical sense, but in the physical sense, in that it's basically turning business away. Because who on earth wants to set up a business in Scotland when all you're going to get is aggro and worried whether or not your business is going to survive and see it through the next 10 years? So, terrible situation that we're in, but so many good people trying to get us back on an even keel again. And that's what our programme is about. Well, this, Ian says something, remembering 7/7 today, 16 years ago. That was the terrible bombing in London. It will take more than a few bombs to break the spirit of the British. Absolutely. Well said, Ian. And Michael, good morning to see you. Now, I was on the phone to somebody this morning and they were just telling me how annoyed they were and bothered with the whole situation as far as the COVID thing is concerned. And the reason is Boris has said, as we know, he gave his big speech, he says he's essentially going to open up the country on the 19th of July. So everybody watching, everybody watching believes, oh good, he's going to open up the country, by which we would understand as the United Kingdom. He is, after all, the British Prime Minister, isn't he? Isn't that wonderful? So I know somebody, they've got children, their children think that Scotland is going to be opening up on the 19th, because that's what Boris Johnson, the leader of the country, is saying. But unfortunately, because of the disaster of devolution, because of the absolute nonsense of devolving the COVID situation to the four parts, what it means is the four parts actually have four different laws on the matter. And so when Boris says he's going to open up the country, unfortunately, he's only talking about England, okay? What he's saying is not going to be happening in Scotland. This is the absolute absurdity of all of this. You're looking at what we understand as the leader of the country, but he's not actually leading the country. He's devolved the crisis to people like, to his political enemies, basically. He's devolved the crisis to his political enemies. Now, what sort of person would do that? You'd have to be a bloomin' idiot to say, right, we're in a crisis here. The country is in a crisis. I'm the leader of the crisis. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give my political enemies say over how to handle this. It beggars belief, really, in a national emergency, okay? Devolution is for things like dog licensing and stuff like that. It's not for a national emergency. So he's got himself into this situation. He is, quite rightly, in our opinion, going to open up. He should have opened up previously, in our opinion, but he's going to be doing it, he says, if he's to be believed, he's going to do it on July the 19th. And let's hope that that happens. And he's saying, use your common sense as far as whatever you want to do with masks and social distancing and things like that are concerned. Well, one person who does not like using their common sense is, of course, Nicola Sturgeon. Common sense, as was pointed out to me very eloquently this morning, common sense is the last thing that she wants people to exercise, as my colleague pointed out so well. Nicola Sturgeon's whole modus operandi is control. It's not leaving you to decide what you commonsensically think you should do. Oh no. Oh no, when has Sturgeon and the SNP ever done that? They'll never do that. Oh, goodness sake. James says that you won't be listening to anything the wee dictator says. I often don't. Good. Basically, Sturgeon is going not to open up on July the 19th. Now, as far as I can understand it, and as far as everybody else can understand it, she is going to move Scotland to what she calls level zero, of course. Level zero, that doesn't even semantically make sense. Anyway, level zero of her 5-tier lockdown system. She's going to move to level zero, whatever that is, on July the 19th. But it won't be until August the 9th when she wants to lift all remaining restrictions, including social distancing indoors, allowing life in Scotland to return to, quote, almost complete normality. So we've basically got until August the 9th to wait for that. And you can be assured that on August the 9th that she's going to keep us basically locked down, because she and Boris, to an extent, have got themselves into this crazy situation whereby COVID is measured by cases which are positive tests, which are not, as we've been saying now for almost 18 months, are not infections, are not symptoms, are not hospitalizations. They're simply positive tests of what is essentially dead genetic material. And so as long as people keep that case narrative going, we're never going to get out of this. We're never going to get out of this. And everybody's to blame. You know, unionists are to blame as well for this, because they'll attack Sturgeon and say, Scotland's got the highest number of cases, and it's Nicola Sturgeon's fault. It's nobody's fault. Actually, the people's fault that it is the people who believe cases are equal to symptoms and infections. If you believe that, you're actually just maintaining this whole carry-on, okay? Cases 2 years ago used to require symptoms, sneezing, illness, the evidence of infection. Cases had to show evidence of infection. And then for some reason, all of that got thrown out the window, and a case was simply a positive test, even though you were perfectly healthy, even though you were expressing perfect health. If you had a positive test, you were a case. And so cases changed from infections to simply being healthy. And as long as that situation continues, as long as the case narrative continues, we'll never get out of this. Okay? That's at the heart of it. And that's a problem for Sturgeon's administration and for Boris Johnston's government as well. Is this whole case narrative needs to get thrown out. And we never use it, and we never knock Nicola Sturgeon because cases are rising. It's irrelevant if cases are rising. If you're testing more people, you're going to get more cases as night follows day. The question is, are these cases infections? Are these people showing symptoms? And in virtually every single case, they're not. So in other words, the whole thing is just absurd on its face. So anyway, providing what the numbers of cases are going to be like, and there'll still be cases around forevermore, but we are going to get our Freedom Day in Scotland on August the 9th, and England gets it in July the 19th. But until society throws out the case story, the case narrative, until we get rid of that, we're going to continue to be subject to all the lies of the system and the lies of the mass media. So we have to see through that, break away from it, and do our best in our own life to do that as much as we possibly can. And God bless us all and give us strength in that, because we are up against an incredible amount of propaganda. I mean, I work during the day, I often have YouTube or whatever playing in the background, and every hour, at least 10 times, I will hear messages about getting an injection. Well, you can stuff that where the sun doesn't shine, my friend, because myself and others will never allow that to be injected into our bodies. But it's constantly pushed on us to an extent that I've never seen in my life, and which I find personally horrifying. Callum Harvey says his Such a Volume boys tested positive. Well, they're playing on the internet, but that's fun, guys. I hope you get back on your internet games soon, and well done for the 1-0 win, and basically congratulations and Such a Volume. We can do this, guys. Okay, come on. Now, talking about football, we do of course have the England semi-final tonight, which many people are looking forward to, and we do wish the England football team the very best of British luck, because I and we at A Force for Good don't care if you're Scottish, English, Welsh or Northern Irish, you're British. And somebody else who came up with that very good point was the Crankies. They were interviewed yesterday on Good Morning Britain. For some reason, I'm not quite sure why they went to the Crankies for an opinion, but they asked, Susanna Reid asked, will you be singing Come On England? And Ian, the chap, replied and said, yes, certainly. We're British and Scottish. Let's stick behind Britain. If it was Wales or if it was Ireland, we're all one. It's against the Europeans. We want to win. Fantastic stuff from the Crankies. Yes, certainly, we're British and Scottish. And that's true. And if England bring home the European Cup, then that's a victory for Britain. And that's one of the great things about being British. You, as we've always said, you can share in the joy of all the other parts of the United Kingdom. If you only see yourself as Scottish or only see yourself as English, you can't be happy when Scotland wins something. If you only see yourself as Scottish, you can't be happy when England wins something. But if you see yourself as British, if you have that all-inclusive attitude and identity, then you can take joy in the fact that another part of the British Isles is winning something. So when I look back on 1966, I always remember that's when Britain won the World Cup. Okay, it was England specifically, but it came home to Britain. So let's hope that the European Cup comes home to Britain. If England can beat Denmark tonight, fingers crossed, and if they then go on to beat Italy in the final on Saturday. Okay, guys, football, bring it home, not just for England, but bring it home for Britain and for all your supporters throughout the British Isles and indeed the world. And then once you've done that, just stop with the kneeling nonsense, okay? Stop with all of that. Although I was pleased to notice there was one English football, Maguire, who did not kneel at the last game, but stood. So good for him. Good for him. A man among men. Eileen says, we'll be rooting for England. And absolutely, Sandra, England versus Italy. That's almost like, that would be a World Cup final almost, wouldn't it? Sandra says, at last, common sense on the COVID nonsense. Cases mean nothing. Stop testing, stop taking tests. Uninstall the app if you have it. Oh yeah, I mean, the app is literally government tracking of you. It's incredible how many people signed up willingly to that, for the government to watch their every move. I mean, when I have Adam says, talking of Cornwall, I didn't know we were talking of Cornwall, Adam, but talking of Cornwall, people think that Cornwall is a forgotten fifth nation when it's a county of Britain. Yeah, I've never been to Cornwall, I don't know what it's like, but I've heard it is very beautiful. Adam says, we'll have people like Sturgeon who'll say that restrictions are being imposed on us against our will. Yeah, well, she's the one that's imposing restrictions at the moment, and there's no question about it. If anybody ever wondered, if anybody ever thought that you could have Scottish independence in order to have like some kind of libertarian free state, then the last 10 or whatever years, 15 years of Scottish national government have paid to that, because they are the most authoritarian people, and their authoritarian tendencies are hugely on display. But as we've always said, that is a trait of a certain type of Scots person, to be extremely authoritarian. Always has been, going right back hundreds of years, and the SNP is just the modern manifestation of it. Secular manifestation and just, yeah. Here's Richard's got an interesting thing. The Apostle Paul's analogy of the body applies to the United Kingdom. If one member of the body suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honoured, all rejoice together. I like that. I like that. If one member is honoured, all rejoice together. That's the way it should be. That's the way it is in Britain. I'm going to note that one down. Richard, thanks for sending that in. That definitely adds value. Definitely adds value. Well, today is the 7th of July, and it was mentioned that there was that terrible bombing on the 7th of July several years ago. On this day, 8th of July 1647. Now, have you ever looked at the back of the old 50p coins and seen Britannia sitting there with her short sword, a trident and shield and the lion, and wondered, I wonder who that was ever modelled on? I wonder who the woman was that modelled that for the coin artist. Well, I can tell you that on this day, 8th of July in 1647, the Scottish baby who would become the young woman who would become the face of Britannia on our coins was born, and that was Frances Teresa Stuart, who would go on to become the Duchess of Richmond and Lennox. And she was born in Paris because her family had taken refuge at the French court of the Queen Henrietta Maria. And her father, Walter Stuart, was a supporter of Charles Stuart's claim to the throne. Now, this was during the period of the British Civil Wars, when Charles II was in exile, and the throne was being argued over by the parliamentarians and the Roundheads and the Cavaliers and the Covenanters, and all of those boys having a stushty about who should be running the country and how exactly they should be doing it, and whether or not you should kneel or bow or do whatever that was getting on their nerve at that particular moment. So however, in 1660, after Charles II was returned to the British throne, she travelled to England to his wedding to become the maid of honour when he married Catherine of Braganza. And she caught his eye, and when he wanted a medal to be struck to commemorate the Peace of Breda, which was a treaty with the Dutch, then he got her to be the model of it. And Samuel Pepys wrote, "At my goldsmith's I did observe the King's new medal, where there is Mrs. Stuart's face as well done as ever I saw anything in my whole life. I think, and a pretty thing it is, that he should choose her face to represent Britannia by." And the artist who created that medal then adapted that image and reproduced it on the copper coins, which her face thereby is still in circulation today on those 50p pieces which portray Britannia. So that's Scotswoman Frances Teresa Stuart, who became the face of Britannia under Charles II. And she went on to she died, and she left Lennox Love House, which is in Haddington, East Lothian, to her nephew at the time, and she's buried in Westminster Abbey. That's Teresa Frances Stuart. And also on this day, 7th of July, in 1930, one of Britain's greatest authors, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, died. And he was born in Edinburgh to Charles Doyle of Irish Catholic descent, and his mother, Mary, of similar descent. And he created Sherlock Holmes, of course, and he modelled Holmes after his university medical school lecturer. And what I find interesting about Conan Doyle is he stood for Parliament twice as a Liberal unionist candidate, and he stood in Edinburgh in 1900, and he stood in Hawick in 1906, but he wasn't elected to Parliament, but he stood as a Liberal unionist, and he's buried in Minstead churchyard in the New Forest, where the epitaph on his gravestone says, "Steel true, blade straight, Arthur Conan Doyle, knight, patriot, physician, and man of letters." That's really concise little epitaph, which I like. Steel true, blade straight, knight, patriot, physician, and man of letters. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, born in Edinburgh, died on this day, 7th of July, in 1930. So these are a couple of dates in British history which we always like to connect our British history into a Scottish angle and show how Scots through the centuries have been so influential on the things that we now take for granted in our great United Kingdom, in our great kingdom of United Britain, which is another way of saying it. Colin says, remember all Scottish and English veterans who lined up on a battlefield and lived and died for their country. Name one person who kneeled and prostrated themselves for them. No sacrifice is greater than our own, and if you cannot kneel to your own sacrifices, then kneeling to other causes is simply offensive and disrespectful to our mothers, fathers, and veterans that defended you, me, and the rest of us. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, let's get rid of this banner. I think we... Okay, good. Now, something that's been preying on my mind for the last week, and I want to get it off my chest because it really irritated me, and I don't like things that really irritate me because I have to get them off by expressing my anger at them. And it was something which occurred on the 1st of July, and it didn't even occur in this country, but it occurred in Winnipeg in Manitoba. And over there, there's a bunch of people who have got a bee in their bonnet about Canadian history. And from an overwrought perspective, I should absolutely add, but who are using a particular matter, which I'll get to in a moment, in order to attack the institutions and symbols of the Canadian state. I'm talking about the fact that a bunch of vandals pulled down a statue of Queen Victoria, who was hugely influential in the creation of Canada, but even worse, pulled down a statue of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Now, of course, the Queen is the head of state of Canada, just as she's head of state of the United Kingdom. We share a very close history with Canada, and we, of course, do share our head of state as well. So an attack on the head of state anywhere in the world where we share the same head of state is an attack also on Britain. So we would expect a very powerful, strong condemnation from the British government of what happened. But of course, we've been noticing in the last 18 months that strong condemnations are never forthcoming from the British government when it relates to things like that. Now, what's the story here? Well, it's part of the whole Black Lives Matter thing that's going round the Western world at the moment. Canada does not have a history of slavery at all. And so the BLM type people can't really work up anything to do with race in Canada, because it's really been quite it's never had any real racial issues to speak of. The only thing it's ever had was when the Europeans, the British and French settlers, came upon the native peoples and wondered how best to integrate them into the Canada that was driving ahead at that time. And during the late 1800s, Canada began to come together as a federation under the Glaswegian John A. Macdonald, because Canada has a huge Scottish diaspora, and in fact, to a large extent, Scots invented Canada. And the first Prime Minister of the Canadian Federation, which came together in 1867, was John A. Macdonald, from a family, and he was born in Glasgow. And he was the Canadian Prime Minister from Confederation, which was 1st of July 1867, until he died in office in 1891, although he had a few years out in the middle there. Now, basically, under his premiership, he came up with the idea to copy the Americans, who had a boarding school system where the Americans would take Native American children and try to integrate them through boarding schools. And he came up with that idea as well for the native peoples in Canada. And these were called residential schools. Now, what people don't understand is the first residential schools were set up probably in 1880 is the best that I can find, but they lasted, okay, until 1996, when the last one was closed down. So they lasted over 100 years. And what has since happened since 1996 is, because of the successful, ultimately, integration of the native peoples in Canada, many of them have become legislators, and many of them become quite influential, and so they have now started to complain about what happened in these residential schools from the position that the white Europeans should not have tried to integrate the native peoples into the white European ways, that this was somehow evidence of a sense of white supremacy or even racism at worst. Well, to be frank, you could argue that the whites believed that their system was superior to what the native peoples were living in at that time. You could certainly argue that. But the point is, when the Europeans and the native peoples came together, what were the options for the white Europeans, who had all the power, who had all the drive to build modern Canada? What were the options? Well, one of the options was that the Europeans could have said, forget all this railroad building stuff and all these modern big buildings and stuff. Let's all just integrate into the Native American ways and go and live in the wilds like them. Okay, that's one option. Well, that wasn't going to happen, okay? So we're not going to integrate to the native peoples. The other option, of course, which perhaps some people may even have suggested, was just leave them be, just ignore them. Just leave them to their own devices. But again, nobody was going to suggest that practically, because at that time, the native peoples were in a perilous state, because their main source of food, buffalo, was essentially going extinct. And so to leave the native peoples be would have been to basically leave them to die. And nobody was going to suggest that practically, and certainly not ethically. That was not an option. So the only option in the Canada was to introduce as best as they could the native peoples into modernity, which they did by the residential schools. Now, during Macdonald has got an awful lot of criticism for this, because well, from today's perspective, it's easily criticisable. However, what's not noticed or pointed out so much is that it was a voluntary system. There was no compulsion under it. Now, Macdonald died in 1891, and compulsory residential schools for native children did not come in until 1920. And I only discovered this reading this really good article, which we'll put up, called "The Fight Over Canada's Founding Prime Minister." Attacks on symbols of nationhood are not merely symbolic, they strike at the nationhood the symbol represents. This is a really good article by David Frum in The Atlantic, and he points out that at least most of the problems of the residential schools didn't occur until 30 years after MacDonald had passed away, until 30 years after MacDonald wasn't even on this earth. And by all accounts, MacDonald was a fair and very liberal man, and by the standards of his day would be considered very much to be a liberal sort of minded individual, a very good man, and we do want to stand up for him there. So, of course, we hear about the terrible things allegedly that happened in residential schools, but goodness me, you could make up terrible tales about what happened in boarding schools and residential schools throughout the Western world prior to 1970. You know, everybody's got a horrible tale to tell about what happened to them at residential or boarding schools. I mean, it was a different world, basically. A different world. And a dangerous world as well for a child, because the amount of children dying of disease was massive. I mean, if you were born in the late 1800s, and indeed the first half of the 20th century, you know, your chances of getting out of childhood were often slim, depending upon where you were born into. So there's huge infant mortality and child mortality back in those days anyway, and there was of course no welfare state. So when you're looking at how do we best take care of these native children, there was no welfare state to do it. You needed these church schools, these residential schools, which to an extent gave room and board to children who might have suffered badly in other ways. And of course, the native children were not the only children to suffer. I was reading an article in the National, as it happens, about orphans in Scotland, and orphans in Scotland would get shipped out to Canada, and goodness knows what happened to them. You know, many of them would not survive the passage, let alone the actual time in Canada. And so the Native American and the Native Canadian people are not the only people whose children have suffered, but they were not the only they were not the only children who suffered in the 19th and early 20th century, for goodness sake. And politicians need to stand up and just say that. You know, like, don't give me your sob story. My ancestors' story is just as bad. You know, I get really irritated by the idea that we've got to, I've got to care. I mean, thousands of Scottish children died in the 1900s and early 20th century. So why have we got to care? We should all care. We should all care, but don't try and make your suffering more important than somebody else's suffering when we live in a world where we've all suffered. So there's that. Anyway, what's happened is that this has grown into a political movement now, and the whites in Canada, who are awfully liberal and kind of soft anyway, they won't say what I've just said, for example. So they just get booted upon, you know, they just get stamped upon, and they just get walked over whenever anybody plays a racial angle like that on them. They just succumb, and they're just so wet, it's ridiculous. So this has now it's now got to the stage where there are people pulling down statues of the head of state of the country. Now, what did Boris Johnson do? And I do have to blame him, and I'm not having a go at him as such, but he is the man that carries the can, so I do have to talk about this. Now, so what was his response? I'll read it in full. He starts off, or a spokesman from Downing Street starts off, "We obviously condemn any defacing of statues of the Queen." Well, that's not a proper condemnation, okay? We obviously condemn is a throwaway condemnation. And then it even gets it wrong, because the statue wasn't defaced. The statue was actually pulled down. But then it goes straight into saying, we obviously condemn any defacing of statues of the Queen. Our thoughts are with Canada's Indigenous community following these tragic discoveries, and we follow these issues closely and continue to engage with the Government of Canada with Indigenous matters. Our thoughts are with the complaints of those people who are presuming to speak for the Indigenous people. Well, what about your thoughts for us British and Canadians who are upset and angry and troubled that the head of state of our countries has been attacked in this way? What about giving us some thoughts? You know, what about our thoughts for this vandalism which has occurred? You know, do we have a say in the matter? Do you care about us? Our thoughts are with Canada's Indigenous community. No, how about your thoughts being with the people who support Canada's history, who support Canada's constitution, who support Canada's political structure, who support Canada, who support our head of state, who support our traditions and symbols? How about your thoughts being with us for a change? Or at most, how about your thoughts being for both of us? You know, how about saying that? But no, we're just like forgotten about. And here's the thing, when something occurs like a bombing or vandalism, there's three ways of responding. You can respond by an outright condemnation, you can respond with an excuse, or you can respond with a cheer. Those are the three fundamental ways of responding to something. So let's take the 7/7 bombing, for example. The correct way of dealing with that was outright condemnation. We will find the perpetrators and we will punish them, and we will ensure nobody tries anything like that again. Another way of doing it would be, as many people did during the time, I might add, well, that's bad, and I don't like people dying in a bus, but it's understandable considering what the Americans are doing in Afghanistan, or what the Israelis are doing in Palestine, or what Britain did during its past, or something like that. That's called an excuse, okay? And all that does is it justifies it in some way. It doesn't actually condemn it. And the third way is to cheer, as I'm sure ISIS did when that happened, and they would say, well, that's what you deserve because of whatever, okay? So when you're faced with something, you condemn it, or you excuse it, or you cheer it. And the thing is, what's it going to be? So what was that response to the pulling down of Her Majesty outside the Manitoba State Legislature? Was that a condemnation? No, it was not a condemnation. It was an excuse, because they went immediately into trying to justify what happened. They immediately, Downing Street immediately prevaricated, it immediately equivocated, and it immediately went into excuse mode. And so, in other words, it was given the green light for that kind of behaviour just to continue. So, what would a proper condemnation have looked like? Let me tell you. This is what the British government should have said. We utterly condemn the desecration of the historical and current much-loved symbols of Canada, Britain and the Commonwealth, and are appalled at this brazen attack on Canada's head of state. Our thoughts are with those people in Canada, the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth and the world who are shocked to see such behaviour and who are hurt by this attack on a respected and loved historical figure, and on our present highly respected monarch, whom we share with Canada and many other nations throughout the world. We urge the Canadian government to vigorously defend the proud traditions and historical symbols of our shared history and of our shared political culture. We urge a robust response to find and punish the perpetrators of these disgraceful acts. That's what Boris Johnson should have said. Now, can you imagine him ever saying that? Can you imagine any politician in Britain behaving like that? But that's what they should have said, because that's a proper condemnation. Now, as for what may have been the purported reasons for why the people in Canada in Winnipeg did whatever they did, well, that is a different matter. And you can deal with that if you want, or you can choose not to deal with that if you want. But it's a different matter. But as soon as you bring it in, to your response, then you do risk excusing the behaviour. You move up a notch from condemnation to excuse to cheering. That's how you would properly respond to it, and that's how I certainly respond to it, and that's how a force for good responds to it. Not through equivocation, not through prevarication, but through outright condemnation. And as for the deeper issues, which are political and which are being exploited deliberately, well, you can deal with those at another matter if you so choose to. And you know, those church burnings as well, at least 10 churches have been burned. Now, you won't hear this. What I will recommend is go to rebelnews.com, which is a Canadian media outlet. It's been banned from, naturally, it's been banned from social media and to a large extent. And it's run by a chap called Ezra Levant, who is a really nice chap. I don't know him, I've never spoken to him, but he comes across really well. He's very eloquent. He's a great Canadian patriot who clearly understands the value of the British world, of which Canada is part of. And he represents everything that's best about Canada and indeed the British world. So he's a great chap, Ezra Levant, at rebelnews.com. And every day he and his crew report on the terrible things that are happening in Canada under the wet rag Trudeau's government, if you could even call it a government. It's just a joke. And Trudeau responding to, and this is another good example, Trudeau responded to the burning down of the Catholic churches by saying, "This is not the way to go." Really? Burning down churches, not the way to go? Okay. Then he said it's unacceptable and must stop. Okay. But then he went straight into saying we must work together to right past wrongs. So straight away he's saying that there are past wrongs that we have to right, and he's linking that with the burning of churches, which all that does is excuse the burning of churches. That's all it does, is excuse it. So he should just simply say burning of churches, not acceptable. And for whatever idiotic reasons people have done it, don't even address those in your condemnation. And you may or may not to choose to address them at another time, but you do not address your opponent's reasoning during your own condemnation. You just condemn them out of hand. But so many politicians in the West don't understand the basics of politics. They get to the places they get to be PM, but they have no clue about how to deal with their political opponents. It's astonishing, utterly astonishing. Anyway, the good news is you've got one or two people in Canada, and you'll really only find them based around trying to organise some kind of fight back to what's going on there. And Ezra Levant did actually get interviewed on GB News last week, and he made very good points along the sorts of lines that I'm making, although he didn't get time to properly articulate them in the way that I've just articulated that to you. So we might come back to that issue at another time, because it's long running, and there is this long running attempt to bring down the institutions of the Canadian state. And don't get me wrong, I'm very interested in everything that everybody's got to say from whatever perspective, including especially the native Indian perspective, which is often a very interesting one. And I'm very happy to hear and listen and to consider all of those things. And I'm glad in many ways that these sorts of things are being brought out. However, I don't like history being taken out of context and deliberately misrepresented in some way with the political purpose of attempting to overthrow the state, which is what some people not all, but some people in Canada are doing with this Indigenous rights movement. They're using it as an attempt to take issues out of context, totally out of their historical context, and misrepresent them in such a way, knowing that most people will not bother to look at the facts, but will be horrified, and they will use that emotion to try to bring down the institutions of the Canadian state. And that's what's happening in Canada, it's what's happening in America, and it's slowly happening in the United Kingdom as well. Anyway, if you want to understand how it's all working, please keep tuning in to A Force for Good and our program, because we talk about these things all the time. And unlike our politicians, we can understand exactly what's going on and the moves that are made or not made and the rights and wrongs of the whole thing. So folks, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the Queen. See you next week.